This happened about 13 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, attending a liberal arts school in Suffolk County, New York. Within the first month or two of my freshman year, I had found myself in a very tight-knit group of fellow theater geeks, 6 guys and 1 girl. They all loved horror movies and ghost stories. I had found my crew. Freshman year was tough, but we all held each other up and made the whole experience more enjoyable for one another. At the beginning of sophomore year, we decided that in October, as the Halloween season was ramping up, we would find a creepy wooded spot in a nearby town some night and scare the crap out of ourselves. And that's precisely what happened. We did some research and found that there was a particularly isolated area about 30 minutes away, infamous for paranormal sightings. The 7 of us split into 2 different cars and headed out into the night. Allow me to set the scene. You turn off a busy main road, flooded with strip malls and restaurants and whatnot, and you are almost immediately greeted by complete darkness. Again, this area was very heavily wooded. It was essentially a large web of winding roads surrounded by trees, very few streetlights, and very few houses. Without a GPS or a good sense of direction, one could easily get lost in there. We all made sure to have fully charged phones and flashlights, just in case, but the goal was to keep driving until we collectively decided to pull over and go exploring. So, per the directions, we made a left off of the main road, driving for 30 minutes or so into this dark network, picking directions at random, just getting intentionally lost. Our cars made a turn and, to our surprise, there was a huge log in front of us, turned on its side. We had reached a dead end of some kind, with nothing but trees behind it. We all got out to see exactly what this was, stepped over the log, and noticed 2 narrow trails leading in different directions. We flipped a coin and set off on the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow that we had to walk single file to avoid getting whacked by branches. For whatever reason, I ended up in the back. I'm usually pretty rational and level-headed, but I have to say, the further we went, the more I was overcome with an uneasy feeling. I kept hearing sounds deep in the woods, unable to shake the feeling we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one who heard these things, so I shrugged it off as my imagination. And, in any case, the whole point of us being there was to get scared. Not to mention the fact that we were 7 able-bodied college students. There was pretty much nothing that could take us down. We headed down this trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to a massive clearing, and I mean massive. It was a large, open field of unkept grass, comparable in scope to a golf course, but not nearly as well manicured. Trees surrounded the entire field, which was so large, we could not see the end of it from where we were standing. I was thrilled to get out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find an area so vast. One of us looked to the right and said, "Hey, check that out." We all turned and there was an old, dilapidated house several hundred yards away. The house was completely dark, with no cars or signs of anyone actually living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, the windows and doors were all boarded up. I managed to peer between the boards on one of the windows, and what I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic, but an otherwise empty room. Whoever used to live here, they were long gone, because there was no way in. And since we were all sufficiently creeped out by the house anyway, we decided to walk closer to the trail we had come in from, have a seat in the field, and figure out where to go next. We walked towards the narrow trail, but before we could sit, my friend Mark stopped what he was doing. His expression dropped, and he pointed. We all turned, and, on a very far side of the field, directly across from where we had come in, we could see someone tall, lanky, and pale dancing among the trees. And by dancing, I mean it was skipping around, grabbing a tree, swinging around it, and then doing the same to another tree. The moon was so bright and the woods were so dark, it actually took a second for us to really understand what we were looking at. Jay, the skeptic of the group, wasn't seeing it. I leaned into him, pointed him in that direction, and said, "Jay, look where I'm pointing. Don't you see that?" He squinted a bit, and the second he saw it, he gasped with everything he had, clutched my arm, and whispered, "What the hell is that?" What happened next sent shockwaves through all of us. Whoever this was, they stopped dancing, looked in our direction, and started charging straight at us. Without even thinking, we freaked and ran back to the trail. Yet again, Jay was the only one who didn't see what was happening. He shouted after us, "Guys, what is it? Where are you going?" After about 15 seconds of running like hell, I heard Jay scream, "Holy crap." I looked back and saw his flashlight following the rest of us into the trail. While the walk into the woods took about 20 minutes, we made it back to our 2 cars, hopped in, and we were peeling away closer to 5 minutes. Once we were a safe distance away, we pulled over, got out, and checked in with each other about what just happened. My heart was pounding, and I know everyone else was feeling the same way. Nearly 15 years later, we are all still friends, living in different states yet keeping in touch through marriages, divorces, and children. But occasionally, out of the blue, one of us will send a group text to the other with something to the effect of, "The woods, that really happened, right?" It most certainly did. That experience is always in the back of my mind, and I'm pretty sure it always will be. Here's the thing that still resonates with me about that night. Whoever it was, they were dancing manically in the woods at 1 in the morning, and then ran directly for a group of young adults, not at all fazed by the fact that they were severely outnumbered. Whatever the cause may be, when he came for us that night, you could be sure none of us wanted to stick around and see what he was truly capable of. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I still remember this day like it was yesterday. My dad and I had several stands spread across an area of about 3/4 square miles. He'd been hunting there for over a decade, and I'd been tagging along with him ever since I was 5. Until I turned 12, I was never allowed to legally hunt. On this morning, we started our day at 5 a.m. I headed to my stand, while my dad and Frank went to 2 other stands about 500 to 600 yards away, over a ridge. Sitting in the dark alone was always a little eerie. Shortly after my dad and Frank left, I noticed a flashlight in the direction they'd gone, about 200 yards away, moving toward me. Assuming they'd forgotten something in the truck, I radioed into them, only to learn they were already settled in their stands. It was clear that it was another hunter, which wasn't an unusual occurrence in these woods. I turned on my light to alert the other hunter was there, but as soon as I did, they stopped walking, turned off their light, and disappeared. It was a bit odd, but I didn't give it much thought at all. I ended up dozing off shortly after, and woke up sometime around 8 a.m. I radioed my dad to inquire about any movement or sightings. He reported nothing, apart from a few distant gunshots. Around this time, I decided to stretch my legs with a brief walk, covering a distance of about 30 yards while trying to remain as quiet as possible. Upon returning to my stand, I scanned my surroundings carefully. I happened to glance to my left, where I had previously spotted the flashlight, and noticed something orange. During gun season, hunters are required to wear orange, so I radioed into my dad and Frank to see if it was one of them. My dad answered and told me it wasn't him, but there was no answer back from Frank, so I grabbed my binoculars from my backpack to get a clearer view of the figure. It became evident that it was definitely not Frank. The person was aiming their rifle directly at me through a scope. I knew that this was a major breach of safety protocol. One of the cardinal rules of hunting is to never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. While it's an uncommon occurrence, some individuals do disregard this rule. This is where binoculars come in handy for proper identification. However, as I looked through the binoculars, the person didn't lower their weapon, even though they knew I was watching them. That's when I started to panic, and I began contemplating worst-case scenarios. Slowly and cautiously, I picked up my rifle, remaining concealed behind trees, and moved away from my stand to get out of his sight. That's when I contacted my dad through the radio to inform him of the situation. He advised me to remain hidden and assured me that he was on his way to my stand in a very laid-back manner. As a 16-year-old especially, I was extremely worried. Looking back now, I could tell that my dad sensed the seriousness of the situation in the tone of my voice, but he remained calm as he spoke to me. At the time, I misinterpreted this as a lack of seriousness on his part. Throughout the course of approximately 10 minutes, I kept an eye on the person. Every time I glanced, they had shifted position, but their rifle remained trained in my direction. My anxiety grew, as their behavior was certainly unsettling. Finally, my dad contacted me on the radio, asking how I was holding up. I explained the ongoing situation, to which my dad responded with reassurance that he was coming closer to my position and would be near me shortly. Then, a gunshot pierced the air, causing me to lose composure momentarily. The questions raced through my mind. Had my dad been shot? Where was he? Did he shoot someone? The minutes that followed felt like hours as I waited anxiously for more information. Eventually, my dad's voice came over the radio. instructing me to come out from my hiding place and head in his direction. Peering cautiously over the little knoll that had concealed me, I spotted my dad waving from a nearby ridge. I began making my way toward him to gain clarity on the situation. As it turned out, Frank, feeling restless, had taken a stroll and unintentionally ended up on the opposite side of the ridge where the stranger had been standing. Frank hadn't realized what was transpiring, as he'd inadvertently dislodged his radio battery earlier that morning. The gunshot I heard was actually Frank getting a deer. My dad recounted that, as soon as Frank had fired the shot, the stranger began walking away from us, heading toward a logging road. With Frank's deer successfully taken care of, we decided to wrap up our hunting for the day. Once we were back on the road, I finally started to relax for the first time I encountered that hunter. But that changed the next day, when I learned something disturbing. The day before we were out in those woods, 6 hunters were shot and killed, while 2 others were injured, not too far away from where we were. The killer's name was Chai Vang, and even to this day, I still have an awful feeling that he was the one aiming the rifle at me. My childhood best friend, Marie, and I were around 11 or 12 years old at the time. Marie's family had their own campsite in a provincial park about 2 hours away from our hometown, and would spend the entire summer each year living in their camper out there. This particular summer, I was able to go and stay with them for a week, and we were excited to spend our time adventuring around the forest. On the last night that I was there, we decided we wanted to hurry down to the ice cream shop by the lake before it closed. It was early evening at this point, still pretty bright out, but beginning to lose light. The path we took was down a short slope right next to the main road, with maybe 10 feet of thick brush and trees in between. On the other side was the forest, with more tall, thick brush. So we were walking along, not seeing a single other person on the path in front or behind us. Suddenly, we heard rustling and snapping of branches, similar to the sound of maybe a deer moving through the woods. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, but then, the sound of running footsteps followed. Marie glanced back and suddenly grabbed my arm, urging me under her breath to not look back. At the same time, the running stopped. I don't know why I didn't ignore her and get a look myself. I guess I could sense the real fear in her voice and chose to listen. We both started to panic, getting that feeling like when you're running up the stairs after turning the basement light off. We picked up speed as much as we could without breaking into a sprint, knowing the ice cream shop was only about a minute walk away at that point. The path soon broke, and we were in the parking lot. Suddenly, Marie steered me hard to the left, heading towards the lake and the boat rental instead of continuing straight to the ice cream shop. I went along with it silently, understanding ice cream was no longer an interest right now. Marie was clearly panicking at this point. We were both looking around, but it seemed that whatever scared her was nowhere in sight at this point. Marie walked up to the boat rental and got us a kayak, and we climbed in and began to paddle out into the middle of the lake. As we were paddling, she told me that there was a man behind us, and that the man had stopped running at us very abruptly upon making eye contact with her. He had been wearing a long black coat with the hood up, despite it being the middle of July, had a terrible smirk on his face, and she swore that as he stopped running, she saw him put something shiny into his coat. He appeared to have just emerged out of the bushes after we walked past, given the sounds we heard right before he came running onto the path. We reached the center of the lake and stopped paddling. I pulled out my Nokia brick phone that my parents had thankfully given me just in case. I handed it to Marie and told her to call her parents to pick us up. As the phone rang, I saw her look out past me to the shore and go pale, lifting a hand to point to what she was seeing. I turned, and there was the man, stalking his way around the path that circled the edge of the lake, staring right at us. We sat in the middle of the lake and watched him do 2 full laps, never looking away from us, before finally disappearing. It took a few tries to get a hold of her family. We were freaking out so bad the whole time, especially because the sun continued to get lower and lower. We did manage to have someone come with the truck, but by the time we reached the shore, it was pretty dark outside. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't been able to call for a ride. Looking back, I don't know why we didn't just go to the ice cream shop, inform an adult there, and ask our parents to come get us then. But it worked out. We got back safe, and we thankfully never saw the man again. It's been about 11 years. It was an autumn night, and I decided to take a little walk around our housing estate with my dog, Sunny. Sunny is a big, black Labrador mix. She's a great dog and very cuddly, but for some reason, she hates other female dogs. She also has a strong protective instinct, so she always snarls when she doesn't know or doesn't like someone or something. There were no street lights inside the settlement. The only lighting was provided at the house entrances. There was a small park with playgrounds between the rows of houses, but as already mentioned, everything was in complete darkness. Due to this, Sunny's dark fur blended in with the darkness, only to be heard now and then when she was chasing a rabbit into the bushes. I should also add that she wasn't on a leash. I only ever use her leash if other female dogs are nearby, since she's extremely obedient and always comes when I call her. So, while I strolled comfortably through the dark settlement, Sunny ran happily through the area in the bushes. I always only guessed where she was, because I could not see her, so I could only hear her from time to time. At some point, I noticed a small shadow that was whizzing around me. When I looked more closely, I could see Sunny. She was running in large circles around me, and I initially thought she was chasing something. But the circle she drew grew smaller and smaller. She didn't make any noise, and I went on comfortably, because I thought she was having her so-called 5 minutes, where she tends to act crazy. At some point, I didn't see her anymore, but I went on knowing she would follow. Then, I heard a sound. Footsteps, but they weren't my own. I was startled because they were so close behind me so suddenly. I turned around but couldn't see anything thanks to the darkness. I got nervous and called for Sunny because it could have been someone with a dog. Sunny didn't come, and I easily panicked. She suddenly appeared in front of me out of nowhere and began to growl as violently as she ever has before. My blood froze because it couldn't be a good thing. Then she started growling and walking straight ahead for about 2 or 3 meters. Then she stopped. At that moment, I recognized a figure, completely in black. This person was shocked in front of Sunny and didn't move an inch, as Sunny started barking like there was no tomorrow. The person slowly walked backwards, towards the lighted house entrances, and then I saw Sunny bare teeth in front of a young man wearing a hooded sweater, who probably started to experience the same fears as I did when I noticed him. Because of how quietly he snuck up on me, he couldn't have had any good in mind. Since it was too dark, however, he could not see Sunny, and she must have surprised him at the right moment. Sunny leaped at the man who let out a terrified scream, and I was able to hear something fall out of his hand onto the ground. He ran, and my dog followed. After I had released myself from my shock stiffness, I called out to Sunny as loud as I could, until after a short time she was standing in front of me again, wagging her tail. I took her on the leash and then went to where the guy had dropped something, and indeed, there was an arm-thick branch on the ground that he certainly didn't have with him to throw sticks. At home, it gradually dawned on me that my Sunny did not have her 5 minutes when she circled me, but she had long since noticed and kept an eye on this piece of crap person to protect me. The whole encounter was definitely creepy, but also a relief. I was, and still am, so grateful for Sunny. This happened in New York City years ago when I was a freshman in college. I was out partying one night with some friends. I wasn't drunk or on any hard drugs, but I definitely wasn't entirely sober. Around 3 a.m., we went our separate ways, and I got off the train and began walking home. I had to take a longer route home that night because some train lines were under maintenance. When I got off the train, I realized I had to walk past the cemetery and started to feel uneasy, but I wasn't afraid for any real reason. It was only about 10 blocks and I'd be home. I always saw trucks lined up on the cemetery blocks, and being it was a desolate area, I assumed truckers would park their trucks by the cemetery to take naps or sleep before continuing their routes. Back then I thought nothing of it. A few minutes after getting off the train, I heard a faint sound of what I guessed was a car or truck door being shut behind me. I turned around and saw nothing. I scanned my surroundings once quickly and didn't see any other person ahead or behind me as far as I could see. I kept walking, this time a bit faster, and about a minute later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned as quickly as possible, and I saw a man walking fast a few feet behind me. When he saw me turn, he began catcalling me by making kissing noises. I was used to these catcalls, especially living in New York City. By my house, there would be a line of men on the corner every morning, waiting to be picked up for construction work, and every time I passed them to go to the store, I would get catcalled and harassed. So, I ignored him and kept walking, but definitely faster this time. A few seconds later, he was running up to catch up with me, and he was now at my side, speaking to me in Spanish, which I don't speak. He grabbed my arm tightly and began pulling me toward him, so I reacted by screaming and fighting him off. He pushed me up against the cemetery fence and, in the midst of this, my heart sunk to the floor, as I thought I was about to get raped, or worse. Seconds later, he had me off my feet by both arms, and his face turned white in the moonlight. He had a face of pure horror as he looked past me into the cemetery, fixated on something. He let out a blood-curdling scream and let me go. As I dropped to the ground, he was already across the street and running out of sight. Choking on tears, shaking, beside myself, I picked myself up and ran as fast as I could for the last few blocks to my house. I did not turn to look inside that cemetery once. I did not turn around at all. I did not stop until I was home. I never took that train or walked past that cemetery again, and to be honest, I never told my parents, and only told a handful of friends over the years because till this day, I still don't understand what happened, but something probably saved my life. I'm a short 29-year-old woman, and I work in a pub, so I often get out of work quite late on the weekends and usually head home around 2 a.m. I never wear my headphones when I'm headed home at night, so this particular night was no different than usual. Alarm set, doors locked and checked, said goodbye to my colleague, and then we went our separate ways to get home. I usually cross the grocery store parking lot to get home that is well lit, and that night something struck me as odd. There were a couple of cars parked there, which is normal, but something just felt off. I looked over my shoulder and clocked a guy in a hat walking a distance behind me. This wasn't necessarily weird, but I decided to keep an eye on him nonetheless. I exited the car park to the main road that I lived off of, but still had a good mile or so to go before I reached my flat. I checked over my shoulder again, and sure enough, this guy was walking the same direction as me. The distance between us was starting to close, so I decided to cross the road, which I'd usually do at that point anyways. Looking over my shoulder, I was able to not only look for traffic coming, but I was also able to keep an eye on him. I crossed the road and didn't bother to look back for a few minutes, assuming he had stayed on the other side, but I began to hear footsteps approaching. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the guy was about 20 feet behind me. I had a soft drink and a glass bottle in my bag, and figuring I was overreacting, but better safe than sorry, I stuck my hand into the bag and gripped the bottle. Another 45 seconds went by, and the guy was close enough to touch me, but he slowed to my pace and said, "Hello, how are you?" I ignored him and didn't respond. I long ago gave up on pretenses of being polite if I feel uncomfortable. A stranger's feelings matter less than my feeling of safety in any given situation. But he persisted in talking to me. "Hi, are you going to work?" "No," I was being short with him. "Are you going home?" "Yes," I said coldly. "Do you live in this direction?" I just looked at him. He tried again. "Do you live off this road? Where do you live? Do you live close by?" I didn't respond and slowed my pace, letting him walk on. I was still gripping the glass bottle, ready to hit him with it should he try anything. He tried to slow down so I would catch up with him, but I slowed down so much that I was barely walking. He was maybe 300 feet away at this point, and simply stopped and turned around, watching me and waiting for me to catch up with him. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and tried my phone. Of course, my phone was dead. I figured it would last the walk home, but the dodgy battery had other ideas. Surprisingly though, I wasn't afraid. He had started walking again, but still quite slowly. He looked over his shoulder again after another minute, and I seized the opportunity. There was a path to a block of flats that was obscured by tall hedges, so I leapt behind them. I waited for nearly 10 minutes, never letting go of that bottle the whole time. I peeked around the hedges to make sure he was there, as I also peeked behind bins and bus stops to make sure he wasn't hiding in wait. But as far as I could tell, I had lost him. Maybe he didn't mean anything by this, but if you suspect a woman is afraid of you and she is walking alone at night, don't speak to her. It will not help. Especially don't ask her where she lives repeatedly. I was not drunk. I did not appear to be drunk or need any help. I was just walking home as I ordinarily would. I am, however, inclined to believe he had bad intentions. I would rather be too cautious than not. To understand the setting of this story a bit better, I'm going to provide some context first. This took place after I graduated high school and moved away from my family. I moved up to Alaska again, and I say again because I lived there before and attended college there. At the time, conveniently, my mother had been renting out our old house instead of selling it. I say conveniently because the long-standing residents had moved away, and therefore I was awarded the old house. I had to work quite a bit to keep up the payments, but my mother pitched in. It should also be made aware that I had recently broken up with a girl who had been staying with me in the old house I was renting through my mother, and this breakup was unclean and dysfunctional, much like the relationship itself was. Now to the story. It was winter break, which meant I would be spending more time inside than I normally would. It was somewhat lonely in the house, especially being newly single. Also, there are no neighbors really to speak of, as the house was in an extremely wooded region a few miles out of town. One late afternoon, soon after I thought the whole breakup predicament had come to a close, I was made quite aware that it wasn't. My cell phone began ringing from an unknown number, and I decided to pick it up. It was, of course, my ex. She began telling me about how great her new boyfriend is, and how horrible I was and am, the sort of talk that you can almost smell the booze off the caller's breath from miles away. I actually listened until she decided to hand the phone to her new boyfriend, where he was instead sounding oddly threatening, and I decided to hang up in the most polite manner possible with a "have a good day." Days later, again with my mind beginning to forget, I was laying on the living room couch watching some TV. While laying there, I noticed something extremely unsettling. A person was standing in the window behind me. I could see them through the reflection of the TV screen. I didn't move an inch. I had no gun, I had no knife, I had nothing but my wit and my fists. I just lay there, watching the reflection. Eventually, it moved away from the window. Normally, that would certainly be creepy for anyone to witness, but for me, it was much worse. I was taking into account that the house was nowhere near another, so that was an immediate red flag. If someone was just wanting to talk, they'd knock. I was most certain that it was that boyfriend of hers. Nothing became of that situation, but similar situations continued, such as a car pulling into the driveway and no one getting out, and then leaving inconspicuously. A few days later, I was laying in bed at night. It was getting late and I was getting ready to sleep. I got another call from an unknown number. It was her, but this time, she was asking me to come outside and come see her because she wanted to deliver an apology. Annoyed, but ready to settle this once and for all, I decided to go outside. I opened the door, and of course it was incredibly dark. I didn't see anyone, so I said into the phone, "I'm outside." She responded, "Come around back." With this, I began to walk on the snow-covered ground in the darkness in my boots. The motion light turned on as I crossed the garage and the driveway. The snow masking the ground was tinted yellow by the light. I rounded the corner of the garage and turned my phone to see. There was a road that runs behind my house and connected to the driveway by bending, and I made my way towards the road. There was a part in the trees that allowed me to walk straight to the road, so I cut through the path. I then asked into the phone, "Where are you?" "I'm in the car. I see you." I stepped onto the road and saw her car parked a few dozen feet away from me with the lights dimmed. "So, what's the deal?" "I just want to talk. Come here." I approached the car and made my way around to the passenger side, and I finally saw her face. She waved me in, and I opened the door and sat down in the car. I looked at her and she said, "Look, I'm sorry. I know I've been a real jerk lately." Then, of course, she abruptly stopped speaking because car lights started shining behind us. Naturally, I assumed it was her boyfriend, and by the look on her face, she did too. The car parked behind us, and sure enough, the boyfriend got out and stormed over to my side of the car. He yanked on the door handle, and the door swung open, and he attempted to grab me, but I grabbed his wrist and got out of the car. He was completely livid, screaming a bunch of nonsense to me, making false accusations about why I was with her, and a ton of insults. I tried explaining the situation to him, but it was like talking to an angry wall. He gave me this look of utter enragement before swinging at me and, of course, missing. A little scuffle ensued, and all that happened was him swearing and eventually slipping and falling before yelling that he was going to kill both of us. I just stood by her car as he pulled away. She gave me a lift back to the house, and she was scared that he'd try to attack her next. She ended up sleeping in the guest bedroom in my house before I woke up hours later. There was a banging at the back door, and I knew this because the back door was directly below my room. She came into my room with an awful look on her face. I stood up quickly and went to my closet, then grabbed my Louisville Slugger. She was sitting upright in her bed with her hands embarrassingly covering her eyes. I didn't say anything before walking down the stairs slowly, attempting to be silent. The lights were off, and there were no windows on the staircase, and the banging on the back door had audibly ceased. I held the bat tightly, making sure it didn't bang into the wall to signal my position at the time. I remember how slowly I stepped down, especially on the bottom 3 steps, which were always the creakiest. Once I reached the last step, I froze, and it still gives me chills to this day. The hardwood floors creak around the bottom of the staircase, and there was a creaking that was growing closer and closer. I raised the bat above my head, ready to slam whoever it was right on the top of the head. The creaking grew closer until I could hear it from my side, and I planned to swing as soon as it was in front of me. I listened ever so carefully, holding my breath. The creaking was just feet away, and I squeezed my hands tighter than I ever had before around the bat, waiting to swing. This time, they were directly in front of me, and I slammed the bat down hard. I hit something, and whatever it was crumpled to the floor with a bang and a loud crack. I turned on the light, and there he was, the boyfriend. He had shot his gun directly at the floor and left a hole in the hardwood floor. My ex came down the stairs and was crying profusely, muttering, "I'm so sorry," over and over. I called the local police station, and 4 cop cars pulled into my driveway along with an ambulance in a matter of minutes. I sat there at the base of the stairs, watching the boyfriend. He was breathing. I could tell from his chest slowly inclining and declining off the floor. I had grabbed what I think was a 9mm off the floor and kept it in my hand with the safety turned on, and I just shook my head over and over in utter disbelief. I explained the situation to the police as the paramedics rushed in and carried him out on a stretcher. All in all, I didn't get to sleep until the afternoon the next day, after all the stuff had been finished. He ended up actually being induced into a coma and eventually recovered, but a restraining order had already been filed in advance. I never ended up moving though. I had considered it heavily, but nothing has ever happened since. This happened a few years ago when my father was still alive, but I'd be lying if I said it still doesn't creep me out to this day. When my father got sick, he refused to go to a nursing home, in addition to not taking medications prescribed by his doctor that without a doubt would have extended his life. I live on the opposite side of the country now, but he never left my childhood home in Alaska. I've never been a fan of negative 30-degree temperatures, but it never seemed to bother my father. Once I was told that he only had about 2 months to live, I decided to go out there and live with him in his final days. The house is pretty far off the beaten path, which isn't saying much considering that's practically the entire state, but the nearest town was about 20 minutes away by car. Anyways, I arrived in the middle of January, and I moved myself in for the time being. Not having to work while I was there, I spent a lot of time exploring my hometown and catching up with a few long-lost friends. A couple weeks after being there, we started getting hit with huge snowstorms, almost to the point that it was nearly impossible to open up the front door in the mornings. The old snowplow we had barely worked with the amount of snow we were getting, so I'd spend at least 3 to 4 hours a day shoveling the half-mile-long driveway so I'd be able to get my car out. Well, on one of these days, I had just finished clearing off the driveway. It was around 1 in the afternoon. We were in need of groceries, so I made a trip into town and ran a few other errands. While I was out, I got a call from my father. "Are you home?" "No, I'm still out shopping. Why?" I said. "Then who's here?" Aside from a multitude of medical issues he was dealing with, he also had pretty bad dementia, so that didn't automatically send me into a panic. He'd often get confused, misplace things, just typical problems that come from living with dementia. With this in mind, I pretty much shrugged it off and told him I'd be home soon, then went back to whatever it was I was doing in that moment. Looking back now, I wish I had taken his call seriously. I arrived back home about an hour later. It was about 4 p.m., so there was plenty of visibility despite the constant snow. As I pulled up to the house, I noticed footsteps circling the entire front end of the house. I knew for a fact that they weren't mine, and I had a hard time believing it was my father's, but I decided to play it safe. My father was a big hunter back in the day, so I immediately grabbed one of his old rifles out of the garage and did a quick scan around the outside of the house. I followed the footsteps, and they circled the house multiple times, unless there were multiple people walking together. Regardless, this was enough to cause actual concern. I followed the footsteps to the front door where they stopped. The door was locked, just like I left it, so I grabbed the house key and went inside. I immediately called out to my father, who was in his room watching TV. I asked him what exactly happened earlier when he called me, but he had no recollection, which was obviously frustrating. I asked him if he remembered going outside at any point, and he said no, but that didn't necessarily mean he didn't. After explaining myself as to why I was holding the rifle, I checked the entire inside of the house. Nothing was out of place. I shrugged it off and assumed it must have been my father, but I did sleep with the rifle that night just in case. Well, another week passed, and nothing else happened, until I was sound asleep in the middle of the night on a Saturday night. I slept on the first floor across the hall from my father, just in case he needed anything in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of something rattling. It took me a few seconds to get my bearings, but it didn't take me long to realize that it was the front door. I grabbed my rifle and quietly peeked into my father's room, hoping it was him wandering around. When I saw him sound asleep in his bed, my heart sank. Someone was trying to break inside the house. I made my way down the hallway towards the front door and was instantly hit with a cold draft of air. The front door was wide open. I flipped on the porch light and noticed what looked to be multiple sets of footprints. I'm not sure how many exactly, but I was able to make out at least 2 different prints in the snow. Not knowing whether they were inside the house or outside, I went straight to my father's room, woke him up, and brought him out to my car while I called the police. Obviously being shaken up, I drove a few miles down the road and waited for the cops to arrive. They searched the entire house, but it came up empty. However, they did find wet footprints leading through the entrance to the basement of the house, in addition to footprints in the snow leading away from our house into the woods in the backyard. If that wasn't creepy enough, I learned that whoever entered the house did not actually break in, but rather used a key to unlock the front door. I know for a fact that every door leading into the house was always locked, especially after the first encounter I had with the footprints and then the strange call from my dad. I still to this day have no idea how someone would have acquired a key to the house. I know my father had a couple spares, but they were all accounted for when the police searched the house. I did, however, have every lock to the house replaced because someone was clearly able to enter and leave as they pleased. I have no guess as to who it might have been. We don't really have any neighbors nearby, and the house is as secluded as it gets. As anticlimactic as this may all sound, I'm still really freaked out because unless that was their first time entering the house, this could have been going on for much longer than I thought. And with my father's dementia, he may have already had some sort of encounter with them and just didn't remember. He died last year, and the house is now in my name, but I'm still scared to go back there, especially alone. For context, I was 26 at the time of this happening, and I'm a female. I was out late on my way home from work on a Saturday night around 11 p.m. when I needed to get gas. I pulled into a gas station that was usually pretty busy, but it was completely bare, not a car in sight. I also live in Alaska, so as you can imagine, it was very cold on this night, about -10. Usually being tired after work and just wanting to get home, I usually start my pump and sit in my car due to the freezing cold, but this time, I had a weird feeling that I needed to stand by the pump, so I did. I had just started pumping my gas when a golden sedan pulled up right next to me. A guy got out, and for some reason, I was very hypervigilant of this. I watched as he started cleaning his already clean windows, which definitely caught my full attention. As soon as he put the squeegee back, he started heading directly towards me. I felt like I wanted to run, but I stayed calm and continued pumping. Once he was just a few feet away, he asked me if I would help him put windshield wiper fluid in his car, claiming that he ran out and didn't know how to open the hood. I laughed it off and told him I didn't know either, which was obviously a lie. However, he kept getting closer and closer to me while trying to lure me into his car, saying that there was something under his seat that he couldn't reach because he was too big. Now, I'm 5'2" and petite, and this man was large and scruffy, definitely some sort of Alaskan wilderness dude. At this point, I was freaking out, so I hit the call button on the pump. As I did that, he took a step back and started to go back to his car. I thought I was being smart, plus my gas was almost done. As he was walking back, I glanced over at his car and noticed that the driver's side door and back seat door were both wide open. When I looked closer, I felt my heart stop in my chest. Except for the driver's side door, none of the doors from inside the car had handles. I quickly turned around, put the pump back, and fumbled around trying to get the gas nozzle shut. As soon as I turned around, he was right behind me. I was completely petrified. Before I could even move, he grabbed my arm and slammed me against my car. Out of pure adrenaline and instinct, I elbowed him as hard as I could in the face. I started to scream at the top of my lungs, and thank God for the gas attendant, who came charging out with a gun, because if not for him, I don't know what would have happened. The attendant pulled the security video, and we made a police report. Nothing ever came of that footage, and I have no idea where he went or where he is now. I just hope he already hasn't targeted another girl. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough to not feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I could only see what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around the house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away, because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes. I even gave him a spare key, so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple seconds of silence before I heard loud footsteps as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was about from their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans, with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in my house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture was knocked over. I stayed crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he had stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, and the sofa had been flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often used to smoke meth, so they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with family or friends that night and to get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with the flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the back door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, except now I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. My boyfriend, who I live with, works as a teacher in a town about 15 minutes away by train. He gets home more or less at the same time every day, give or take an hour or so. I, on the other hand, work from home. In late January of this year, we'd gotten in a pretty big fight about something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about now, but it was one of those fights where we didn't speak to each other, text, call, or anything the whole next day. So, this afternoon, I was lying in bed getting work done. It was a Tuesday, and I was pretty sure his last class finished at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, meaning he'd surely be home at 2:30. But around 1 p.m., I heard the front door open and shut. I thought, I guess he's home an hour early today. It was normal for him to skip his last class every once in a while, so I didn't really think anything of it. In fact, I was mostly mentally preparing for the awkward post-fight, hey how's it going conversation. So, I continued to lie in bed and do my work, as I waited for him to come in and change his clothes. The bedroom door was closed, and I had earplugs sort of half in, as I usually do when I'm working, but I could hear the heavy footsteps of him walking around the apartment, as he always does. If we hadn't been mid-fight, and I wasn't so preoccupied with the awkwardness of it all, I might have noticed it was strange how slow the footsteps were, or how long he spent walking around the living room. But I was caught up in the dramatics of the fight and didn't think about it. I was just lying there, waiting for him to finally come in. Finally, the bedroom door slowly opened just a few inches. I turned my head towards the door and prepared to give him a sort of awkward, we've been fighting for 24 hours smile, but the door didn't open more than a few inches. I looked and saw that it was a woman's hand with red nail polish on the doorknob. Whoever was there slowly closed the door just as they opened it, without entering the room. I jumped out of bed, ripped out my earplugs, and sort of froze there for a few seconds while thinking rapidly. My first thought, that was not my boyfriend. Then I thought, could that have been his mom or his sister, or the landlady? For some reason, I concluded that surely it was his mom or sister. So, I opened the bedroom door and walked into the living room. There wasn't anyone there, but the room smelled heavily of women's perfume. Then I came to my senses, and realized his mom and sister didn't have keys and have never come over before. The landlady has never entered without permission. That was a stranger. I ran back into the bedroom and shut the door, now shaking heavily. There's a balcony connected to the bedroom, so despite the cold January rain, I stood on the balcony and called my boyfriend. He picked up, and I asked him if his mom or sister might have come over unannounced. He told me, "No, don't move. I'm calling the police." The police were there in minutes, and they searched the whole apartment. Of course, nobody was there by that point. It was weird though. Nothing was missing from the apartment, despite us keeping a full jar of money right in the entrance. Nothing was even touched. In fact, it seemed like the intruder came straight to the bedroom, saw my legs on the bed, panicked, and left. Plus, you can't open that big wooden front door without a key. For a few days, my boyfriend and I were convinced that it was just the landlady being nosy. I began to feel better. Nevertheless, we demanded that the landlady change our locks. When she came to change them with her husband, she made a discovery. There was a square area by the keyhole that had been scratched away with something. The landlady said that someone definitely used tools to break into the apartment. A day or two later, my boyfriend said, "I have to tell you something, but don't freak out." He told me that the orange kitchen scissors were missing, so I obviously freaked out. I tore the apartment apart looking for those scissors. It's been 6 months now, and those scissors are gone, so the whole thing is just creepy and weird. A stranger breaks into a nice apartment, but doesn't touch or take anything valuable, not even the money jar, then takes the scissors from the kitchen, goes straight to the bedroom, sees someone in bed, and immediately leaves. This happened back when I was 16 years old. I lived in a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a middle-class suburban community with my mother, 2 younger brothers, and our 140-pound Doberman, Turbo. In order to understand this story, I'm going to provide some context first. From the front door of our house, you could see directly into our living room, which had an open concept floor plan with the kitchen and dining room. Our couch was on the wall directly in front of the front door. It was the summer between my sophomore and junior year in high school. My brothers and I spent a decent amount of time outdoors, because this was back when people still did that. I suppose anyone paying attention knew who lived in our house, and I suppose they knew that the only adult was gone when the only car was gone. However, prior to the man showing up at the house, I'd never noticed anything off, and I never noticed anything afterwards, so maybe we were just a random target. It was a Saturday, and my mom and the boys had run to the grocery store. In Nevada in the 90s, almost no one had air conditioning, so to cool off, you would open all the windows and doors and use fans. On this particular day, I had the sliding door and front door wide open to get a cross breeze. Neither screen door was locked. I was napping on the couch in full view of the front door in shorts and a tank top, with unlocked doors. It's good we gain intelligence with age. In my defense, there was 140 pounds of protective dog muscle on the floor next to me, and that's probably the only reason I'm alive. Around the approximate time I expected my family home from the store, Turbo began barking. Assuming he was barking their arrival, I told him to shush and tried to go back to sleep. Turbo, thankfully, continued to bark, becoming more and more intense and even aggressive with his barking. Finally, after 5 to 10 minutes, or Turbo refusing to be quiet and my family never coming in from the car, I sat up, realizing something was wrong. A man who I didn't know was standing at the door, seemingly frozen, staring at my frenzied and barking Doberman. Assuming that the man had some appropriate business at my home, I hurried the 10 steps to the unlocked screen door, constantly shushing Turbo. I apologized for my dog, and for not hearing his knock, even though we didn't. The man explained that he was from the phone company, and that he was here to check our lines. He never took his eyes off Turbo, and Turbo never stopped snarling. I leaned forward far enough to see the road. Only unmarked, privately owned cars lined the streets. I looked at the man who was dressed in tennis shoes, jeans, and a t-shirt. I was 16 and dumb enough to nap in front of an unlocked door, but I was no fool. Phone company personnel, for 1, always wear uniforms and always drive company vehicles. 2, don't come without being called. And 3, they don't work weekends. I looked at the man, who had yet to look up for my dog that was now foaming at the mouth. I grasped the screen door handle and held it. This got his attention. He met my eyes as I said, "You have 30 seconds to show me identification, or I open this door." I don't even think he made an incoherent excuse as he ran away. I fell to my knees and hugged Turbo. I then gave him all the meat in the fridge. I believe with absolute certainty that I would have been attacked if we hadn't had him. I like to think that if we hadn't had a huge, overly protective dog, I would have been in the habit of locking doors, but what would a screen door latch do against an intruder? That creep stood there and watched me for 5 to 10 minutes. Perhaps he was paralyzed in fear, but maybe he was working his angles and only Turbo's insistent display of willingness to kill anyone who threatened him changed his mind. That's my theory. Turbo is long past, but his legacy lives on. Today, 2 loving, loyal, and lethal when necessary dogs sleep in my room every night. This happened about 2 years ago. I had just moved about an hour and a half away from home, and it was my very first time living away from my childhood home. I was working on a kids' activity camp. All the staff lived in 2 massive cabins in the woods. There were about 40 people in each, 2 or 3 to a room, so you can imagine how big the cabin was. Anyway, everybody became really close, and some people knew each other from previous years working at this particular camp. None of us really locked our doors because we all knew each other and everybody hung out in different friends' rooms all the time. At this camp, my job was working with the kids during the day and doing evening shifts at the bar, which was there for the staff, parents, and teachers that had come with the children. One night, my roommate and I were both working an evening shift at the bar. She was finishing a couple hours earlier as she was on a different shift. My roommate, Debbie, decided that she was just going to go back to the room to read and wait for me to finish so we could watch a movie. She had been gone for about 5 minutes, which is how long it takes to get from the bar to the cabin, when my phone started ringing with her caller ID. I picked up the call, since the bar was pretty dead that night and the only people in there were staff. When I picked up the phone call, nobody was saying anything on the other end. I put this down to her just about dialing me by accident, so I hung up. About a minute later, I got another phone call from a friend that lived across the hallway from us. She told me that I needed to come back to the room right away, so I asked the guy I was working with to cover while I popped back over to the room. I walked down the hallway, and there were about 5 people just standing outside of my room. I walked inside, and Debbie was just standing there crying, which isn't like her at all. Our stuff was all over our room. Please know that this is very weird, because I'm pretty sure I have OCD, and often tidied my side and her side of the room, even if she didn't want me to. She went on to tell me that her phone had gone missing. I then asked her about phoning me before I came back to the room, and she had no idea what I was talking about. This meant that someone had taken her phone and knew who to call straight away. Also, when she left work, there would be no point in stealing her phone, as it was literally worthless. It was a $10 phone at the most. A few days later, we started noticing that things had gone missing, but not normal things people would steal. They could have taken laptops, Kindles, a PlayStation, or games, but instead, all they took was my bra and underwear, some clean and some dirty from the clothes basket. This made me feel sick, especially because we knew everyone that we lived and worked with. For a few days, I kept getting these phone calls from Debbie's phone with just silence on the other end. We obviously went and reported it, and our bosses said they would look into it. We kind of got blamed for leaving our doors unlocked, which I understand as being really stupid now. The creepy thing was, a few days later, I walked into the staff lounge, and Debbie's phone was just placed on the windowsill. Nobody was in there, and nobody seemed to be around. Well, at that point, I noped out of there as fast as I could and locked myself in my room until Debbie came back. Nothing ever came of it, and we never found out who it was, but I definitely have a feeling that it was someone who knew us quite well, especially someone who knew when we'd both be out of our room. For the life of me, I still don't know who stole my stuff, my roommate's phone, and who trashed our room, but I have definitely learned a lesson, and that's not to leave my door unlocked. In 2015, when I was 18, I met a guy named Ryan on OkCupid. We talked for a month or 2, and then went on a few dates, and after 2 months, we had our first kiss and everything became official. He had moved to my state from California and told me it was because of a bad breakup with his ex of 3 years. I didn't really dig for more info because it seemed to upset him, and the past was the past. We took things slow because he was a good old-fashioned kind of man, and I loved it. He opened doors for me, genuinely cared about my interests and well-being, and even cooked and brought me lunches sometimes. Fast forward to January 2016. My grandmother was in the hospital. He took off work and stayed by my side the whole time, only leaving to make food runs or runs to my parents' house for things we needed. Sadly, on the 3rd day, my grandmother passed. I stayed at his place and he had to force me to eat because I was just so depressed. I didn't want life to go on without her. My mother recommended that I moved in with him so I could have the best emotional support. Eventually, after lots of care and therapy, I got better, but I was still very depressed. Then, disaster struck again in March, when I got a phone call from my mother and she asked me to put Ryan on the phone. His face grimaced, and he just said, "Okay, I understand," then handed the phone back to me. My mother then told me that my grandfather, who had moved in with her after my grandmother's passing, had also passed away. She and my family had come home from a baseball game and had found him in the backyard. He couldn't live without my grandmother anymore. Ryan had gotten very close to my grandfather in the few months between my grandmother's passing, and my grandfather would often call him to spend time together because he wasn't used to being alone. The death took a toll on Ryan as well. A few months passed, and everything just felt gray. Then May came up. Ryan took me to where we had our first date, and he proposed. I thought that I had won the jackpot, and now instead of always feeling down, I had something to look forward to. But here's where things got weird. After he put a ring on me, his attitude changed. He started not liking me hanging out with my friends without him. He became jealous of my male coworkers, insisting that they liked me and constantly tried to get me to quit, just possessive in general. Things only got worse when I had a false positive pregnancy test. We were so excited to be expecting a baby. We already had names picked out, and even decided to put the wedding on hold to put our focus on buying a house for our now growing family. A week or so later, I just felt off. Something told me to take another pregnancy test, which came back negative. I was understandably heartbroken, but when I told Ryan, his reaction was worse. He started crying uncontrollably, but eventually that sadness turned to anger. He started accusing me of losing the baby on purpose because I didn't love him, and then switched gears to, "You must be cheating on me," and lost the baby to hide it. Looking back, I don't know why I stayed, but at the time I just figured it was him just grieving. He continued to accuse me of cheating for months. Even if I took a shower after work, he'd suspect cheating, or even if I smiled at my phone. He even went through my phone while I was asleep and deleted every guy on my phone besides him, my brother, my dad, and my stepdad. Then he started making me send him Snapchats with random objects with timestamps to prove to him I was where I said I was. Eventually, somehow, we got past it and decided to move in with my dad so we could buy a house faster. I picked up a second job for extra money to purely go towards our home, and Ryan decided that since I had 2 jobs, he could just quit his. With his newfound free time, he started buying cars, fixing them up, and then selling them for more money. He would also use this time to stalk my social media and question any guy who liked my post, and eventually started going through our phone bill to see numbers I was texting. He then found the breaking point. He discovered that I sent more texts in a month than he did, which to him was evidence that I was cheating, because in his words, I had no friends. He brought this up to me one night, and I was able to talk him down and explain to him how that's insane, even showing him that I only text him, my mom, my female best friend, and my boss, with the occasional text to my dad or uncle. We went to bed, and the next morning, he went on about it again, so I said, "I'm not having the same fight twice," and walked out of the room. In response to that, he took my car keys and stole my car. He started texting me about how I had never loved him and that I could go ahead and report the car stolen, that he doesn't care anymore, and that he might as well drive off a bridge. I finally convinced him to bring it back, and I got in the car to go to my mom's and broke it off with him. But the story doesn't end there. He then said he only does crazy things like that because he has depression, and I ignore him if he doesn't do something crazy. He promised to get help if I gave him another chance. My dumb self believed that and agreed, but only if he would go to a psychiatrist. He went for about 3 months, got diagnosed with bipolar depression, and was put on a treatment plan. Things started looking better, then all of a sudden, they got bad again. He then told me that he had stopped going because they wanted to take away his guns, and he stopped taking his medicine and flushed it down the toilet. I broke it off with him again because he broke his promise, but then he started stalking me. Anytime I'd get a new male friend on Facebook, he would message them to leave me alone and that I was cheating. He said, "I hope the next guy you date beats and rapes you so you learn to appreciate me." He would show up at my work and hang around my whole shift trying to brag about random Tinder girls he'd match with. He even figured out where my new apartment was and tried to get my roommates to let him in. He started giving out my contact information to creepy dudes, saying I was easy. I eventually cut all contact after he started dating a 19-year-old girl, and he bragged about just using her to pay his bills, as he didn't work. Then he told me he had gotten her pregnant, but would leave her in a heartbeat for me. After I'd cut the contact, I did a little research and found the real reason he left California. He stabbed his ex's brother for trying to defend her after she broke up with him. He also had several domestic abuse charges in 3 other states and had a few warrants out for his arrest. I ended up feeling bad and sent the girl the screenshots of the information I had found, as well as the text he sent me about using her. She didn't believe me and said I was just his crazy jealous ex, then she blocked me. As far as I know, they now have 2 kids, and she's the only one who works. This happened 9 months ago on the 3rd night at our new apartment. My husband, small kids, and I had just moved here to the US from abroad. We were awaiting a huge shipment of all our belongings, so our new 2 bedrooms were totally empty, except for the new mattresses on the floor of the master bedroom, where we all slept while awaiting our stuff. So, just for a little context, our apartment was part of a newly built, high-end complex of 3-story condo buildings in a great location. Our second floor, a 2-bedroom unit facing the back, gave visibility to nothing but train tracks, trees, the sound of crickets, and a building site just beyond that. It might not sound like it, but the view is really neat. The freight trains could be very noisy at times, but I actually enjoyed it a lot at first. On this particular night, my husband was snoring horribly. Like the previous night, I couldn't sleep at all because of it, so this time I gathered up some of our bedding, went into the empty second bedroom, and crashed on my little boy's pool mattress. The trains were noisy, but compared to my husband's snoring, it was relaxing and I fell asleep fast. I woke up though, at about 2 a.m. to extremely loud train noises, hissing, grinding, and squeaking, but that wasn't what woke me. It was the heavy vibrations that I felt. I chalked it up to the idling train outside of the bedroom window though, and got up to use the bathroom. On my way back to bed, I crossed the empty living area to check on the kids, and paused in front of the huge window and balcony door for a minute or two, thinking about the noise. I briefly contemplated going out to the balcony since it was such a hot night and my sleep was so bad anyway, but I went back to bed instead. About an hour or so later, I was awoken to more loud noises. These ones felt like they were directly above me. Lots of heavy thumping and thudding that went on for more than an hour. My head was foggy and heavy from a crappy sleep. I wasn't coherent, so I didn't bother trying to reason out the cause for so much noise after hearing the train all night, so I fell back to sleep for a few more hours. My husband woke me in the morning, asking me if I had seen the huge ladder on our balcony. We went out to look, and there it was, a huge metal ladder leaning up against the side of our building. Someone had pulled it up onto our balcony so they could then climb up to the one above us. There were also 2 empty beer bottles sitting on our stroller and a few cigarette butts extinguished on our windowsill, so they'd obviously been taking their little breaks on our balcony. We could see between the balcony floorboards to the door above us, and sure enough, it was completely smashed. The wood frame of the door was in splinters and practically ripped out. We called the police immediately, and they came right away. Apparently, the sole female occupant was away in Florida at the time of the break-in, thankfully. The police didn't give us a lot of information, but they told us that although the entire apartment had been destroyed and ransacked, nothing appeared to be taken. I spoke to the building manager later that day, who told us that every single cushion and bit of bedding had been ripped open, that every single drawer and piece of furniture had been pried open, but that all of our expensive electronics were unscathed, as was a huge glass vase full of money. She returned to her apartment after a week or so, but we never did see her in person. We later heard through another employee of the complex that this tenant had a dangerous ex-husband who couldn't let go, and that it was him who destroyed her place when she realized she wasn't home. I always wonder what would have happened if she had been home. It could have gone down so many different ways. What would the intruder have done if I went out onto the balcony? My precious little kids and husband could have been hurt too. We just didn't feel safe after that incident. The sounds of the trains were just so creepy to hear. We all slept in the same room from that point on, until we switched to a different building a few months later.